Mark Grayson was raised by Omni-Man, Earth's greatest hero turned greatest traitor. But what if Mark never grew up with his loving mother Debbie, and he never learned human compassion or moral values? What if Mark was raised by Battle Beast instead of Omni-Man, the invincible universe's strongest creature with pure desire for battle? For this scenario to work, we need to imagine that during one of Battle Beast's early visits to Earth, perhaps during a routine scouting mission, he encounters a very young Mark, maybe around the age of 5 or 6. This would be before Mark's powers have fully manifested, but Battle Beast, being the expert combatant he is, would sense the potential within Mark before his powers, and sensing he's a Viltrumite. Maybe Omni-Man is away on a mission, or he's already been exposed as a traitor and fled Earth, leaving Mark vulnerable. Either way, Battle Beast would see this young half-Viltrumite as the perfect student, someone with incredible potential who could be molded into a true warrior. Battle Beast's decision to take Mark wouldn't be based on sentiment or parental instinct. It would be purely practical. He would recognize that training a Viltrumite hybrid from childhood could result in the ultimate fighting companion, someone who could potentially give him the challenges he's been seeking his entire life. So he would simply take Mark from Earth without hesitation, leaving Debbie devastated and the world wondering what happened to their young child. Mark's upbringing under Battle Beast would be radically different from anything we've seen in the original story. There would be none of Mark's original life. Instead, Mark's entire existence would revolve around combat training, physical conditioning, and learning the warrior's code that Battle Beast lives by. From the moment he wakes up until he collapses from exhaustion, Mark would be pushed to his absolute limits every single day. The first few years would be incredibly difficult for Mark. He would miss his mother terribly and struggle to understand why this alien creature has taken him from everything he knew. But Battle Beast wouldn't tolerate weakness or self-pity. He would force Mark to adapt through sheer necessity. If Mark wanted to eat, he'd have to prove himself in combat. If he wanted shelter, he'd have to demonstrate his worth as a student. This harsh methodology would quickly strip away Mark's human sensibilities and replace them with a warrior's mentality. As Mark's powers began to develop, Battle Beast would be there to guide and shape them. But unlike Omni-Man, who eventually showed some restraint and care for his son's well-being, Battle Beast would push Mark far beyond any reasonable limits. He would throw Mark into life or death situations from an early age, believing that only by facing real danger can a true warrior be forged. Mark would learn to fly not through gentle guidance, but by being dropped from great heights. He would develop his strength by fighting opponents who genuinely wanted to kill him. Mark's moral compass would be completely different in this timeline. Instead of learning to protect the innocent and use his powers responsibly, Mark would be taught that strength is the only thing that matters in the universe. The weak exist to be conquered or ignored, and the only honorable way to live is through constant combat and self-improvement. This philosophy would fundamentally alter how Mark views the world and his place in it. By his teenage years, Mark would be an incredibly formidable fighter, having been trained by one of the universe's greatest warriors. He would possess not only his natural Viltrumite abilities, but also Battle Beast's combat techniques and strategic thinking. However, he would lack the emotional connections and moral foundation that made the original Mark such a compelling hero. Instead, he would be cold, calculating, and focused solely on becoming stronger. When Mark finally returned to Earth, perhaps in his late teens or early 20s, he would be virtually unrecognizable to those who knew him before. Debbie would be heartbroken to see what her son had become, while heroes like the Guardians of the Globe would be unsure whether to treat him as an ally or a threat. Mark himself would view Earth not as his home, but as just another planet filled with weaklings who need to prove their worth through combat. His relationship with other heroes would be complicated. Mark wouldn't understand concepts like teamwork or protecting civilians, because Battle Beast never taught him these things. Instead, he would see other heroes as potential opponents to test himself against. Robot's strategic mind might intrigue him, but only as a challenge to overcome. Adam Eve's powers would be interesting, but Mark would want to fight her rather than work alongside her. The Invincible comics' major storylines would play out very differently with this version of Mark. When the Viltrumites arrived to conquer Earth, Mark wouldn't automatically side with humanity. Instead, he would evaluate both sides based on their strength and fighting ability. He might even see the Viltrumite conquest as an opportunity to face worthy opponents in battle, rather than a tragedy to be prevented. Omni-Man's return would create a fascinating dynamic. Nolan would be shocked, and perhaps horrified, to see what his son has become under Battle Beast's tutelage, while Mark would view his biological father as just another Viltrumite who abandoned his training and grew weak through emotional attachments. Their confrontation would be less about family drama and more about Mark proving that Battle Beast's training methods were superior to Viltrumite tradition. Mark's fighting style would be completely different from the original characters. Instead of the somewhat reckless but heroic approach we're used to seeing, this Mark would fight with cold precision and brutal efficiency. He would have learned dozens of combat techniques from Battle Beast and would know how to exploit weaknesses in any opponent he faced. Every fight would be calculated and methodical rather than driven by emotion or desperation. The relationship with Battle Beast himself would evolve over time as Mark grew stronger. Initially, Mark would be the student desperate to earn his master's approval, but as he developed into a truly formidable warrior, their dynamic would shift towards something more like equals. Battle Beast might even begin to see Mark as the ultimate opponent he's been searching for, leading to a climactic battle between mentor and student. Mark's interactions with other cosmic-level threats would be fascinating. Characters like Thragg or Conquest would find themselves facing a version of Mark who shares their warrior mentality but lacks their specific cultural programming. This Mark might actually respect their strength while still opposing them purely for the challenge they represent, rather than out of moral objections to their methods. The question of whether this Mark could ever reconnect with his humanity would be a central theme of this alternate timeline. Occasional glimpses of his original personality might surface, especially when interacting with his mother or facing situations that require compassion rather than strength. These moments would create internal conflict as Mark struggles between the warrior philosophy he's been taught and the human emotions he's tried to suppress. Battle Beast's eventual death would hit this version of Mark much harder than it would the original character, losing the only father figure he truly remembers, and the source of all his training, would leave Mark directionless and alone in a way the original Mark never experienced. This could potentially be the catalyst that finally allows his suppressed humanity to resurface. Mark's romantic relationships would be almost impossible to maintain, because he would view emotional attachments as weaknesses that compromise his fighting ability. Eve might try to reach the human side of him, but Mark would resist these feelings, seeing them as distractions from his true purpose as a warrior. Only through tremendous character development could he learn to balance his warrior training with human connections. The cosmic implications of this scenario are also interesting. A Mark trained by Battle Beast would be far more likely to leave Earth entirely in search of stronger opponents. He might become a wandering warrior, traveling from planet to planet seeking challenges rather than staying to protect his homeworld. This would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the universe. His approach to problem solving would be radically different. Where the original Mark might try to find peaceful solutions or minimize casualties, this Mark would see direct confrontation as the only honorable approach. Diplomatic situations would confuse him, and he would have little patience for political maneuvering or compromise. The psychological trauma of this upbringing would be immense. Even though Mark would appear strong and confident on the surface, he would be deeply damaged by years of isolation from normal social connections and the constant pressure to prove his worth through violence. Therapy or counseling would be foreign concepts to him because Battle Beast would have taught him that mental weakness is just as shameful as physical weakness. Mark's ultimate fate in this timeline would likely be either death in glorious combat, which he would welcome as the ultimate honor, or a gradual rediscovery of his humanity through connections with people who refuse to give up on the person he used to be. Either way, his journey would be much darker and more tragic than the original story, but it would also showcase just how much the environment and upbringing can shape even the most inherently good person. Mark would become an incredible warrior but lose almost everything that made him heroic in the original story. He would be stronger, more skilled, and more disciplined, but also colder, more isolated, and fundamentally damaged by an upbringing that prioritized combat ability over human connection. But did you ever wonder what would happen in other Invincible timelines? If so, make sure to like and subscribe and click on these videos here.